Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the lecture, The Vow That Began the Buddha's Path to Awakening with Dr. Andy Rotman. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Katie Erickson. I'm the new Director of Education here at the Carlos Museum. Many of you are probably familiar with Elizabeth Horner, who's now our Associate Museum Director of Public Programs. So we're very excited for her, but you may get to know me a little bit better moving forward. We are so thrilled to welcome Dr. Rotman, who's a longtime friend of Emory. And we are, again, thrilled to be able to offer this lecture as well. So Dr. Rotman is a scholar of religion who engages in textual and ethnographic work on the role of narratives, images, and markets in South Asia, focusing on early Buddhism, South Asian media, and the modern economies of the North Indian Bazaar. He's the author of many books, teaches many fascinating courses at Smith College. And I just want to keep it short, keep it brief, because I know we have a lot to go through this afternoon. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Rotman for this enlightening lecture.
Hello, everyone. Can people hear me? Is this clear? First, let me give a big thank you to a whole bunch of folks who helped make this happen, including kind of all the organizers here at the museum and others, my friend Sarah McClintock and others who have helped bring me here. It is always nice to come here. It feels a bit like a homecoming, and I just love being here. It's really a stellar museum, really everything about it. And for me, a museum that's also a teaching museum, not just a place where people come to kind of admire beautiful things, but also to learn, I find personally inspiring. Today, we're going to talk about the vow that began the Buddha's path to awakening. This is one of the most famous stories kind of in the Buddhist world, but often one, we could say it's a story that has many iterations. We have earlier versions, we have later versions, and we have some really important versions that are represented in art. Some of the very earliest ones we have, including one that is here at the museum, which we'll get to, which makes this very exciting for me. And it's also exciting because stories that evolve, we can learn a lot by following the evolution. And in this case, by looking at one of the really early stories, we get to understand the Buddha and the Buddha's life story, hopefully in a different way, something that you'll find interesting and thought-provoking. So my talk will be about 50 minutes, but it's fun, right? This is not, I'm trying to make it, it's fluid, it's easy, not a lot of technical terms, so I'm trying to make it super accessible. And then at the end, they'll be open for questions, comments, whatever it is that will help all of you appreciate these materials more. The Buddha's story is generally said to begin not with his birth as Prince Gautama, but instead during a previous birth, many eons ago, when as a learned Brahmin, he made a vow before the Buddha Dipankara, illuminator, that he too would one day become a Buddha. And Dipankara Buddha foretold that in the distant future, this would come to pass. Pictured on screen is the iconic moment when the Buddha-to-be offered flowers to Dipankara Buddha, placed his head at the latter's feet as an act of veneration, spreading out his hair for Dipankara to step on, and made his historic vow. This inaugurated his own path as the Bodhisattva, destined to become the Buddha known as Shakyamuni, sage of the Shakyans. The story exists in many permutations, both in literature and in art, with the name of the Buddha-to-be differing in various sources, Sumedha in Pali texts, Sumati or Megha in Sanskrit ones, and the particulars of the story differing as well. In Pali, the story of the vow is a late addition to the Buddhist canon. Dipankara Buddha, in fact, is completely absent from the canonical discourses of the Buddha, Sutta, making it virtually certain that traditions concerning this Buddha did not gain currency until several centuries after Shakyamuni died. Later, however, there is a proliferation of accounts, such that the story of the vow is by no means only a single narrative. What is often referred to as Sumedha's story, Sumedha Katha, is quite diverse, with different lineages of the story going through multiple revisions and iterations. For example, in the introduction to the Pali commentary on the Jatakas, stories of Shakyamuni Buddha's past lives, there's an attempt to synthesize various accounts of Shakyamuni's life into a cohesive story. As the author of the commentary explains at the beginning of his synthesis, quote, "The story of Sumedha should be narrated here, even though it occurs in full in the Buddha Vamsa, Chronicle of Buddhas, a late addition text to the Pali Canon that chronicles the life of Shakyamuni Buddha and 24 other Buddhas. Quote, on account of the fact that it is handed down in metrical form, it is not quite clear. Therefore, we shall narrate it with frequent statements explaining the stanzas," meaning they make additions to the text to try to make the text more clear for others. In Sanskrit, there are two principal versions of the vow story, each of which is preserved in a text that primarily consists of narratives from the monastic code of conduct of a particular Buddhist community. Nevertheless, even though the two versions of the story share similar origins, they differ significantly in details, especially in their framing stories. One version is preserved in the Divya Avadana, Divine Stories, which is mostly a compendium of narratives excerpted from the monastic code of conduct of the Buddhist sect known as the Mula Sarvastivadins. This version occurs within the story of Dharmaruchi, which begins with the travails of a monstrously large sea creature. Just as the veritable Leviathan is about to devour a boatload of merchants, he hears an invocation of the Buddha's name and vows to refrain from eating. Soon he dies and is reborn as a human with an insatiable appetite named Dharmaruchi, relishing the Dharma, who eventually goes forth as a monk and attains the awakening of an arhat. The Buddha then recounts how he and Dharmaruchi had previously met 3 times long ago during the respective eras of 3 different Buddhas. It is during his account of their time together with Dipankara Buddha that he tells how he made his vow for future Buddhahood. The other version is preserved in the Mahavastu, Great Chapter, which recounts the story of Shakyamuni Buddha over many eons and is a section of the monastic code of conduct of the Buddhist school known as the Mahasangaka Lokotravadin. That version occurs with an extended account of the life of Dipankara Buddha. Only after the episode of the vow is there mention of the story of Dharmaruchi and the various times the Buddha to be and Dharmaruchi met, and this is done in brief as a precursor to the story of another Buddha named Mangala, auspicious. One oddity in tracking versions of the vow story is that its earliest extant renderings likely occur not as texts, but as images. There are many sculptures of the vow story from the first centuries of the Common Era, from the northwest region of the Indian subcontinent, then known as Gandhara, just like the one on screen before you. Gandharan art mostly features images of Shakyamuni Buddha's birth. Gandharan art mostly features images from Shakyamuni Buddha's lifetime, in particular his birth, his departure from the palace to pursue life as an ascetic, and his passing into final nirvana, with far fewer representations of events from his previous births. The vow story is the major exception. Of the roughly 180 representations of past life stories in Gandharan art, nearly 130 of them depict the vow story, a dominance not matched anywhere else in the world of Buddhist arts. And while scenes from the other past life stories are typically depicted on Buddhist stupas, mound-like monuments for Buddhist holy figures, in small panels and subsidiary positions, such as stair risers on the steps leading up the pathway for circumambulation, scenes of the vow are often given pride of place, appearing directly on stupas in panel reliefs. It seems that the vow story not only originated in Gandhara, but was an important element of Gandharan art and ritual practice. Yet the vow story, which is so well represented in Gandharan art, barely exists in Gandharan literature. The version of the story preserved in the story of Dharmaruchi is a notable exception. In fact, there is little or no overlap between previous birth stories as they are represented in Gandharan texts and art, much to the chagrin of art and literary historians alike. And yet this lack of overlap, especially at such an early moment in the vow story's development, is certainly intriguing. In particular, why might the vow story have generated so many images and yet been recorded in so few texts? Did the textual version of the vow story somehow present a problem? And what role might the images of the story have played in Buddhist rituals? Furthermore, why has the vow story become so important, both in text and art, for Buddhists across the globe during the past 2 millennia? In an effort to answer these questions, we will first consider the vow story preserved in the story of Dharmaruchi in the Divyavadana. So now the vow story in this early text, the story of Dharmaruchi. We're going to do it in 2 parts, one part, then kind of an explanation, and then a second part and an explanation. So you get the story and a kind of my modern day commentary on it. The vow story in the story of Dharmaruchi, which makes up about 1/4 of the tale, recounts what transpired when the future Shakyamuni Buddha and Dharmaruchi met during the dispensation of Dipankara Buddha, and how the karmic consequences of their deeds and the karmic connections among characters continued to affect their lives throughout the eons. It also addresses key themes such as the value of seeing a Buddha, cultivating faith, giving offerings, and making vows, as well as the inevitability of karma. Yet the story has a number of peculiarities, especially around the character of the marginalized young woman who, by the power of a vow, will marry the future Prince Gautama in countless lifetimes. The story of Dharmaruchi is an avadana, a genre of Buddhist past life stories that monastic jurist-cum-storytellers followed to create legal documents for the Buddhist community that were also compelling narratives. With this in mind, I'll both retell the vow story and offer a detailed commentary, attuned to the way the text relates to other law codes and how it might have challenged devotees who wanted to use this account to model their quest for spiritual perfection. Vow story, part 1. The story begins with Dipankara Buddha arriving in Dipavati, full of light, the prosperous capital of King Dipa, light, and King Dipa inviting Dipankara to enter. The king also invites a neighboring ruler, King Vasava, to come and join him in honoring Dipankara. Meanwhile, King Vasava, who has just finished performing a 12-year-long sacrifice, is arranging to celebrate its completion by giving away 5 great gifts: a golden water pitcher, a golden bowl, a 4-jeweled bed, 500 Karshapana coins, and a virgin bride bedecked with jewelry, to the Brahman most adept at reciting the sacred scriptures known as the Vedas. 2 young Brahmins, Sumati, very wise, and Mati, wise, who have just completed their study of the Vedas and were thinking that they should now honor their teacher with a gift, hear about King Vasava's plan. Confident that none can surpass them in learning and recitation, they set out for the sacrificial grounds in King Vasava's kingdom. In the meantime, a deity informs King Vasava that 2 young Brahmins are coming and that he should give the 5 gifts to Sumati. When the young Brahmins do arrive, King Vasava offers the 5 gifts to Sumati, who accepts the first 4 gifts, but rejects the gift of a bride, explaining that he is a celibate follower of the religious life. The rejected young woman experiences love at her first sight of Sumati and directly asks him to accept her in marriage, and once again he declines. Since the king has offered the young woman as a gift, he won't accept her back. Such are the rules, which I'll discuss in what follows. The young woman is now on her own. She becomes a devotee of Dipankara Buddha, and in exchange for all her jewelry, she gets a flower seller to give her a daily allotment of blue water lilies that she can use to honor Dipankara in offerings. Meanwhile, Sumati goes to his teacher and offers him the 4 gifts. The teacher accepts 3 of the gifts, but gives him back the 500 coins. That night, Sumati has 10 dreams. I know it's a complicated story, but the commentary will help. That night, Sumati has 10 dreams. He asks a nearby sage to interpret them, And instead, the sage encourages him to go to Dipavati and ask Dipankara Buddha for help. In the interim, King Vasava accepts King Dipa's invitation to honor Dipankara Buddha, and he arrives in Dipavati along with 80,000 ministers. King Dipa begins to make arrangements for Dipankara Buddha to enter the city, and after 7 days, and be honored appropriately. To this end, he arranges for all the flowers in his kingdom to be collected. On the day that Dipankara Buddha is scheduled to enter Dipavati, the young woman goes to the flower seller to gather her daily allotment of blue water lilies so that she can honor him. The flower seller explains that the king has gathered all the available flowers. The young woman asks him to check the lily pond once again, and 7 blue water lilies have miraculously appeared. The flower seller plucks the water lilies and gives them to the young woman, who hides them in a water pot and sets off for the city to see Dipankara. Sumati has also arrived in Dipavati, and realizing that he can't see Dipankara Buddha and not honor him with an offering, you don't go see a Buddha empty-handed. He begins searching for flowers, but he can't find any. He then meets up with the young woman, and by the power of his merit, the blue water lilies that she has hidden rise up from her water pot. Sumati then offers her the 500 coins he has previously been gifted in exchange for the water lilies. The young woman vehemently declines. Quote, here's from the text. "Back then you didn't want to accept me," the young woman said to Sumati, "and now you're begging me for water lilies? I won't give them to you." With that, she then said to the young Brahmin, Sumati, "What will you do with them?" And Sumati said, "I will honor the Lord Buddha." Then she says, "But what use are Karshapata coins to me? I'll give these water lilies to the Buddha unless, as a result of giving them to you, you'll seek me as your wife in every rebirth to come. That is, at the time of giving this gift to the Buddha, you make the following fervent aspiration: may she be my wife in every rebirth to come." Then Sumati says, "We're both intent on giving. Both of us would sacrifice our own family members, even our own flesh." And then the young woman says, "Make the fervent aspiration. Afterward, you may offer me to whomever you wish in marriage." After the young woman has said this, she gave 5 water lilies to Sumati, took 2 herself. Then she uttered this verse: "When you make a fervent aspiration, having accepted the Buddha as your guide, then I shall be your wife, a constant companion in Dharma." Commentary on the first part. What's just happened? Let's pause in the retelling of the story to highlight some key features of the characters and the narrative. Sumati is a Brahmin schooled in traditional Brahmanical Hinduism. He has studied the Vedas, which one traditionally memorizes so that they can be recited for ritual purposes, and he maintains the vow of celibacy, brahmacharya, which is appropriate for a young student. In the Vedic world that he inhabits, the ideal religious person is a married householder. So it is likely that he would one day abandon his vow of celibacy, get married, settle down, and have children. As best we can tell, Sumati has neither heard nor accepted Buddhist teachings before being told to seek out the Buddha to interpret his dreams. The position of the young woman, who remains nameless in the story, is much less clear. Since the king can give her away in marriage, he is apparently her legal guardian. There is no mention of a father, suggesting that she is one of the king's servants. But the king gives her away prematurely, likely assuming that a brilliant Vedic student would want such a woman as a bride and wouldn't want to rebuff the king's generosity. You don't rebuff kings. But Sumati refuses her, citing his continued adherence to a vow of celibacy. Once the young woman has been given in marriage, she can't be taken back, at least not according to Brahmanical rules of marriage. All this stuff has long footnotes, and if anybody ever wants the footnotes, I'm happy to share them with you. So in this given but not accepted state, she abides in a kind of legal limbo, neither wife, nor daughter, nor widow, nor any other conventional role. Women were generally expected to be under the protection of a male guardian, usually husband, father, or son. Brahmanical sources classified such unprotected women as independent and wanton, swarni. grouping them together with prostitutes, perverts, and slaves, and treating them as social outcasts. While the young woman here has sufficient independence to directly ask Sumati to marry her, it's unclear if she could ask anyone else to marry her. Instances of a young woman choosing her own husband, called a swayamvara, or choosing for oneself, are rare in early Indian materials. Perhaps she is simply double-checking to make sure that Sumati hasn't changed his mind. He hasn't. Could it be that Sumati felt the same stirrings of love upon seeing her that she felt upon seeing him? Apparently not. Sumati rejects her, and as a brilliant Vedic scholar, he would presumably have known enough about Brahmanical marriage practices to know that his refusal to marry the young woman would place her in a precarious position. His decision to continue pursuing his own spiritual path as a bachelor would likely lead the young woman to suffer. And the young woman, as we shall see, seems to know this as well. After being rejected by Sumati, the young woman, now homeless, stigmatized, and on her own, tries to create some security and respectability for herself. She removes the jewelry with which she has been adorned in preparation for marriage, even though the jewelry, according to the law books, actually belongs to her guardian, King Vasava, and not to her, and approaches a flower seller with a proposition. She will give him the jewelry if, in return, he gives her a daily supply of blue water lilies for honoring the Lord. With that agreement in place, the young woman, according to the text, becomes a servant of the Lord, Deva Sushrushaka. The term servant, Shushrushaka, is noteworthy here, for it is a technical term in Brahmanical law texts that encompasses both workers and slaves, each with various subtypes. The term is rare in Buddhist materials, and it seems to be used here to place the young woman in a matrix of servitude. She has apparently shifted her service, Shrushusha, from one lord, the king, to another lord, Dipankara. The young woman has no legal obligations to Dipankara, for he is neither her employer nor her guardian, and yet the text is expressing some sense of continuity with regard to the woman's position. The young woman begins to make daily offerings of flowers to Dipankara, and within a week, according to the text, she becomes a lay attendant, upastayaka. Although she now has a form of refuge, she does not seem to be satisfied with her situation, and judging by her response to Sumati's offer of money, her main problems aren't financial. She yearns for an additional lord, Sumati, in this lifetime and in countless lifetimes to come. It seems she never wants to be unprotected again. Important to the story is the concept of merit, punya, that is, the good karma one accrues as a result of performing virtuous deeds. After the flower seller tells the young woman that the king has collected every flower in the city, she asks the flower seller to double-check the lily pond. Quote, if because of my meritorious deeds, there are once again blue water lilies in the lily pond that haven't been plucked, then give them to me. The flower seller complies and finds 7 blue water lilies that have suddenly appeared in the lily pond. The text explains that this has happened, quote, by the power of Sumati's merit, and not, as we might expect, the young woman's merit. The flower seller is hesitant to pick the flowers and give them to the young woman, as all the flowers in the city are to be given to the king. But she explains to him, it is because of my meritorious deeds that they have appeared, so give whatever you pick to me. The flower seller acquiesces with the reasoning that the flowers rightly belong to whoever had the merit that caused the flowers to miraculously appear. Our ability to identify the karmic cause of any event is undermined by the opacity, phenomenologically of speaking, of karma. Ordinary humans simply can't look inside themselves or look into others and know their karmic accounting. Buddhist literature, however, is alive with deities who have special forms of insight, like knowing the karma of others, that they use to intervene strategically in human affairs. A deity knows that Sumati is of the highest standing and informs King Vasava to offer him the gifts from the sacrifice, thus assuring that they will be given to the most noteworthy recipient and, knowingly or not, help Sumati on his way to becoming a bodhisattva. According to the karmic logic of the story, the young woman, who is a devotee servant of Dipankara Buddha and offers him flowers every day, has likely accrued significant merit from these offerings. And she is right that enough merit, within the logic of the story, has the power to make additional flowers magically appear. But she is wrong in thinking that the merit that did so in this case was hers. One's karmic condition is opaque, which means that anyone you might meet, no matter how apparently lacking in qualities, could be on the verge of some great attainment. Even the person who just rejected you in marriage, twice. Both Sumati and the young woman place far more value on being able to offer Dipankara Buddha flowers on this day than on accruing wealth. Sumati has searched diligently for flowers, visiting the homes of various flower sellers and wandering from garden to garden, but he hasn't come across a single flower. When he finally runs into the young woman and the water lilies miraculously rise up from her water pot, he says, "Give me those water lilies and take these 500 Karshapana coins for me as a reward." This is a significant amount of money. Elsewhere in the Divyavadana, it's said that 500 Karshapana coins is how much it takes to feed the entire community of monks led by the Buddha, hundreds of people. Sumati's request to the young woman is rather blunt, especially since the last time they met, he refused her request for marriage. He asks her to accept the money for the flowers as a reward, more like ransom or payoff, nishkraya, as though she were holding the flowers hostage. His lack of politeness might be why the young woman rejects his offers so vociferously. Sumati is still young and chaste, very smart, if not very worldly, and he isn't yet a bodhisattva. But he is right that the young woman has appropriated something that isn't hers, for the flowers are a product of Sumati's merit and, by her own logic, thus belong to him. The young woman is both enamored and angered by Sumati. You've probably seen this in various movies. Someone's enamored and they're angered and they feel like they've been wronged, but they really haven't. It's all very filmic. The young woman is both enamored and angered by Sumati, and yet she also recognizes that he will make great progress on the spiritual path in future lifetimes. As a dedicated spiritual practitioner, she wants to partner with him on that journey and share in that success. But she also wants to make sure that she has the protection of a husband. Crucial to the story is the concept of fervent aspiration, pranidhana, an aspirational vow or solemn resolution that functions as a wish and commitment towards some future goal. After rejecting Sumati's offer of a cash payment for the flowers, she proposes a different kind of remuneration, and she's very specific. She will give Sumati the water lilies if, in return, at the moment of offering the flowers to Dipankara, he makes a fervent aspiration that she will be his wife in every rebirth to come. The ability to make a fervent aspiration is usually dependent on having accumulated a stockpile of merit that one can cash in to make the vow. One can accumulate merit, for example, by making offerings to Buddhist saints or shrines, or if you're fortunate, the Buddha himself, and this merit can then function as the purchasing power for a fervent aspiration, such that one can transform a present wish into a future reality. The young woman wants Sumati to make a gift of the water lilies to Dipankara, which would likely earn him a lot of merit, and immediately cash in the merit to make a fervent aspiration. Sumati affirms his commitment to giving, suddenly sounding like the bodhisattva in his future rebirths who makes gifts even of his own body for the sake of awakening. But the young woman only wants him to commit to the fervent aspiration she requested. Then he can give her away to whoever he wants. She then utters an enigmatic verse promising that when Sumati accepts the Buddha as his guide and makes a fervent aspiration, then she will be his lawful wife and companion in Dharma. Vow story part 2. After the young woman utters that verse, the story, without recording Sumati's response, chronicles how King Dipa beautifies the city of Dipavati and then, accompanied by King Vasava and their respective ministers, welcomes Dipankara Buddha and his community of monks into the city. Dipankara makes use of his magical power so that both kings and their vast cabinet of ministers, each of whom carry 100-ribbed umbrella, think that they alone have been honored with holding an umbrella over Dipankara's head. At the threshold of the city, Dipankara focuses his mind and puts down his foot, which causes a gentle earthquake and a host of miracles, with the blind, deaf, mute, and crippled suddenly able to see, hear, speak, and walk. Hundreds of thousands of beings make offerings of flowers, incense, and perfume to Dipankara. Sumati and the young woman, holding their water lilies, try to get close enough to Dipankara to make their offerings, but they are engulfed by the enormous crowd. Dipankara, realizing that Sumati would earn more merit from his offering than anyone else in the crowd, magically creates a rainstorm that disperses the crowd. Sumati and the young woman can now see Dipankara, and at his sight, both are filled with faith. Sumati tosses his 5 water lilies toward Dipankara, and owing to the latter's power, they magically circle around his head. The young woman tosses her 2 water lilies toward Dipankara, and they magically circle around his ears. The rain has turned the area muddy, so Sumati now approaches Dipankara, spreads out the locks of his matted hair, and utters a verse. If I am to become a Buddha for the sake of awakening others, O awakener to wisdom, may you tread with your feet on my matted hair, which will bring an end to birth and death. Dipankara then places his feet on Sumati's matted hair. His brother, Mati, who's been absent from the story since the 2 brothers visited King Vasava at his sacrificial grounds and they got their gifts, is present to see this and angrily addresses Dipankara, reprimanding the latter for trampling on his brother's hair like an animal. Dipankara doesn't address Mati. Instead, he foretells Sumati's future. You will be freed from human existence, liberated, powerful, a teacher for the benefit of the world, the scion of the Shakyas with the name Shakyamuni, best in the 3 worlds, and a light for the universe. At the moment of this foretelling, Sumati rises up into the air, his matted hair falls off, more distinguished matted hair appears in its place. A large crowd of people sees Sumati floating in the air and makes this fervent aspiration. When he attains supreme knowledge, may we become his disciples. The young woman also makes a fervent aspiration, reciting 2 verses, the first being the one that she had previously uttered when she gave the 5 water lilies to Sumati, and the second one being this, quote, when you are perfectly awakened, the best instructor in the world, at that time, when it comes, I will be your disciple. King Dipa then picks up Sumati's hair that has fallen to the ground and gives it to King Vasava at the latter's request. King Vasava counts up the hairs and finding that there are 80,000, gives 1 hair each to his 80,000 ministers, who bring them back to their respective territories and make shrines for them. Sumati then addresses Mati, acknowledging that he has been foretold to become a Buddha and wondering what Mati has set his mind on attaining. Mati explains that he has been spiritually damaged as he spoke words of anger at Dipankara. The 2 then go forth as monks in Dipankara's order. Sumati learns the Buddhist scriptures and endears himself to the other monks with his righteousness. After his death, he's reborn among the gods of the Tushita heaven, one of the high up heavens. As for Mati, after his death, he is reborn in the realms of hell. Shakyamuni Buddha, the narrator of the tale, then identifies the characters of the story. The people of Dupavati are now the citizens of Shravasti, where Dharmaruchi was born and where Shakyamuni delivered this discourse. The young woman is now Yashodhara, who had been Shakyamuni's wife when he was still Prince Gautama. Mati is now Dharmaruchi, and Sumati is none other than Shakyamuni Buddha himself. Now the commentary. What just happened? King Dipa goes to great lengths to make his capital, Dipavati, beautiful for Dipankara Buddha's arrival. Then he is joined by King Vasava and his ministers, each of whom holds for Dipankara a ceremonial umbrella, which is part of the paraphernalia for both gods and kings. Dipankara is neither god nor king, but his power is such that even kings honor and serve him. And Dipankara's power is considerable. He uses his magical power, riddhi, a set of superhuman abilities acquired through spiritual practice, to instill thoughts in two kings and their ministers, such that they all think that they are personally attending to him. And when he concentrates his mind and places his foot on the threshold to the city, the whole earth trembles and miraculous cures and occurrences abound. The sick become healthy, the angry become loving, elephants trumpet, horses neigh, bulls bellow, musical instruments make beautiful sounds without being touched, and so on and so forth. Such is the power that all Buddhas possess, the texts explain. Perhaps that is why King Dipa wanted him to enter his kingdom. Sumati and the young woman want to offer their water lilies to Dipankara, but they are engulfed by an enormous crowd who want to honor him with their own offerings, so they can't get close enough to do so. Knowing that Sumati will earn more merit from his offering than anyone else in the crowd, and that the ritual of offering requires that he be close enough to clearly see Dipankara, Dipankara creates a rainstorm that forces the crowds to flee. Now Sumati can see Dipankara, a sight one never tires of seeing, according to the text, and he is filled with intense faith. Throughout the Divyavadana and the monastic code of the Mula Sarvastivadin Buddhists, Buddhas, along with saints, stupas, and images of Buddhas, are described as instilling faith, prasada, in those who see them. And faith usually leads those offerings to make an offering, a kind of giving back to whoever instilled faith in them. This sort of giving, which is initiated by faith and directed to a virtuous object, earns the giver enormous amounts of merit. In this case, Sumati sees an object that instills faith, experiences intense faith, and then makes an offering of 5 water lilies, giving back to Dipankara. Dipankara then exercises his powers so that the water lilies magically circumambulate his head, following him wherever he goes, no doubt generating even more merit for Sumati with each auspicious round they make. The young woman likewise sees Dipankara, is filled with faith, and offers him 2 water lilies, which Dipankara causes to magically circumambulate his ears, likewise earning her additional faith. Sumati and the young woman become filled with faith at the sight of Dipankara, which is likely an experience of religious conversion for the former and religious confirmation for the latter. As an outpouring of faith, they each make an offering to Dipankara, which likely earns them enormous reserves of merit. A Buddha is seen as a vast and fertile field of merit, where devotees, punyakshetra, where devotees can plant their meritorious deeds. Thus, any good or bad deed directed toward him, no matter how petty it may seem, can have positive or negative karmic results beyond all expectation. As recipients of merit that is beyond all expectations, Sumati and the young woman experience a radical change in their karmic destinies. Sumati then approaches Dipankara, bows down, and spreads out the locks of his matted hair on the muddy ground before him. By placing his head at the latter's feet, Sumati is performing a common ritual act for honoring another while also expressing one's own humility and submission. And by placing his hair on the ground, Sumati allows Dipankara to rise above the mud, just like a blue water lily, radiant and undefiled. Sumati then utters a verse explaining if he is to become a Buddha, then Dipankara will tread on his hair, which prompts Dipankara to stand on Sumati's dreadlocks. Matted hair is one of the defining marks of non-Buddhist renunciants, as opposed to the shaven heads of Buddhist monastics. And for Dipankara to stand on Sumati's matted hair is a visual representation of Buddhism's dominance over these other traditions. Sumati, it might be said, has fully submitted to Dipankara's authority. Notice that Sumati does not follow the conditions explicitly set out by the young woman. She said that she would give him the water lilies only if he made this fervent aspiration, quote, "May she be my wife in every rebirth to come." It's pretty unambiguous. In fact, Sumati doesn't even make a fervent aspiration. He only utters a verse, Gatam Bhashate, requesting that Dipankara confirm his future Buddhahood by treading on his hair. It seems that Sumati, at least from the perspective of the young woman, has reneged on their agreement. And he hasn't made the fervent aspiration that becomes so crucial and canonical in later retellings of Shakyamuni's journey to Buddhahood. Nevertheless, Dipankara confirms Sumati's request with a foretelling, vyakarana, often translated as prediction, but which functions here as a confirmation of the future, as Buddhists have full knowledge of all aspects of karmic causality. Sumati will be the Buddha named Shakyamuni. His journey as a bodhisattva has begun. After Dipankara's foretelling, Sumati rises into the air and his matted hair falls off and new matted hair appears in its place, affirming Sumati's continued status as a non-Buddhist renunciant. He's not bald, he's still got the matted hair. The fallen hair contains 80,000 strands, and each one of King Vasava's 80,000 ministers takes a single strand, brings it back to his home, and creates a shrine, chaitya, for it. In many Buddhist traditions, hairs of a Buddha are a common form of bodily relic and are thought to be capable of empowering shrines and stupas. Yet, in this case, the hairs don't belong to the living Buddha who is present, Dipankara. Instead, they belong to Sumati, a Buddha to be, but who hasn't yet gone forth as a Buddhist monk and who hasn't begun studying Buddhist scripture. It seems that the hairs are a kind of contact relic, an object that the Buddha owned or used or with which he was closely attached. Sometimes such contact relics include the Buddha's footprints, for in some cases, a Buddha was thought to have transformed a place into a shrine simply by standing there. It seems that by standing on Sumati's hair, Dipankara has imbued it with his power. At the sight of Sumati's miraculous behavior, a large crowd makes a fervent aspiration that they will be disciples of the future Buddha to be known as Shakyamuni. Then the young woman makes her fervent aspiration in 2 verses. The second verse repeats the aspiration of the large crowd. She too wants to be a disciple of Shakyamuni Buddha. The first verse is a restatement of what she uttered previously when she gave Sumati the 5 water lilies. Quote, "When you make a fervent aspiration, having accepted the Buddha as your guide, then I shall be your wife, a constant companion in the Dharma." When the young woman first utters this verse, it functions as a kind of wishful thinking. This is what she wants him to say. She hopes in exchange for the water lilies, Sumati will make a fervent aspiration saying, "May she be my wife in every rebirth to come." He can then offer her to someone else in marriage, but she will be his wife in all of his future lifetimes until he reaches Buddhahood. But Sumati never makes that fervent aspiration. Unlike the young woman and the large crowd, glossed later as hundreds and thousands of beings, he makes no fervent aspiration at all. Now the young woman recites the verse as her own fervent aspiration. She might not be his companion in Dharma, Saha Dharma Charini, that is, his legal wife and partner in religious practice in every lifetime to come, but she will be eventually, at least once and maybe more. It is unclear, in other words, when the then is in "then I shall be your wife." The young woman's fervent aspiration apparently comes true. The Jatakas record at least 32 lifetimes that she and the Bodhisattva shared together before his birth as Gautama. And in the Buddha Charita, Life of the Buddha, Ashwagosha's poetic biography of the Buddha from the 1st or 2nd century CE, Yashodhara is Gautama's legal wife, and she explicitly refers to herself as his companion in the Dharma, using the exact same term. Yashodhara, however, uses the expression not as a wish, but as a lament. Gautama has just abandoned her for a life as a renunciant, and she is befuddled. Quote, "He wants to practice Dharma and yet abandons me, his companion in Dharma, leaving me with no protector. How can he ever find Dharma when what he wants is to practice austerities without a companion in Dharma?" Yashodhara, after many eons and countless lifetimes, finally gets what she wished for. It just doesn't last. Once again, she will be without a lord and protector. But then her second fervent aspiration comes true. She gets to be a disciple of her former husband after he becomes perfectly awakened, the best instructor in the world. Having shared a complicated eons-long history, Gautama and Yashodhara now come together as Buddha and disciple, and according to at least some accounts, Yashodhara goes on to achieve the awakening of an arhat. Okay. Now some lessons from this like crazy and complicated vow story. So what are some of the lessons of this version of the vow story, right? It's the earliest version of the story that we have in text, and one that's preserved in various manuscripts. We know people thought it was important. It shows up in compendium, but it's strange. To summarize, Buddhas are very powerful. And while ordinary humans might accrue enough merit, say, to make flowers arise from a water pot, they are not miracle workers capable of causing earthquakes, rainstorms, and healing the sick. And they aren't fertile fields of merit that allow others to vastly magnify the karmic consequences of their deeds. Buddhas are so powerful, in fact, that the Buddhist path is open to the powerless, like women who exist on the margins of society with no protector, and to non-Buddhists who have never heard Buddhist teachings. The practice offered is simple. See a Buddha, let faith arise, make an offering and accrue merit, and then use the accrued merit to make a fervent aspiration. Noteworthy here is that the Buddha-to-be is still an ordinary human, although a Vedic scholar of the highest standing and capable of earning more merit from a single offering than anyone else who crowded around Dipankara. The story isn't a hagiography of the Buddha-to-be, unlike later versions of the story. It's the story of a smart, high-standing young Brahmin who hasn't yet cultivated wisdom or compassion to the fullest extent. His interactions with a young woman are a case in point, but who is sufficiently meritorious and fortunate to come before a Buddha and make a vow for Buddhahood. It is the story, in short, not of greatness attained, but of a path to greatness begun. Noteworthy, too, is that the Buddha-to-be doesn't succeed on his own. He has lots of help. His is not the solo quest of a solitary seeker. It is, at least in part, a family affair. And it's also a community affair and a cosmic affair, with various participants working in conjunction with one another. There is the teacher who trained Sumati in the Vedas, King Vasava, who gave him post-sacrificial gifts, the deity who informed King Vasava of his standing, the young woman who gave him the water lilies, Dipankara, who scattered the crowd so he could see, and the 80,000 ministers and citizens of Dupavati who follow Sumati throughout the eons, joining him when he finally attains Buddhahood. Karma is not only individual, it is collective as well, and as a result, karmic biographies treat ongoing karmic connections. The Buddha-to-be's story, in other words, is the interconnected biography of a multitude. So, to return to the questions from the beginning of this chapter, why might this vow story have been recorded in so few texts in ancient Gandhara, in ancient India? One can only conjecture, but perhaps there was a problem with genre. The vow story in the story of Dharmaruchi is part of an avadana, and as expected with the genre, it tells of the power of Buddhas and how ordinary humans can avail themselves to that power. It provides interconnected karmic biographies, and it also engages legal issues. In this case, the legal issues gesture to general concerns about women's independence, again, lots of footnotes, which were important for both Buddhist and Brahmanical communities, but they are pursued through the peculiar case of a given but not accepted woman and her quest for security and fulfillment. Perhaps the focus on the young woman's clever audacity and the legal issues regarding women's independence were regarded as an impediment to the story, for these plot lines are much less prominent in later tellings. Or perhaps the Buddha-to-be isn't represented as sufficiently heroic or self-sacrificing, for most past life stories of Shakyamuni Buddha focus on the countless difficult deeds that the Buddha-to-be, once he became a bodhisattva, performed during the 3 incalculable eons it took him to attain Buddhahood. Or maybe it's just that visual versions of the story work better for what the Buddhists in ancient Gandhara wanted to accomplish. So now let's think about the vow story in Gandharan art and practice. So to address the last question, what might Buddhists in Gandhara have wanted visual versions of the vow story to do? And how did they represent the story, highlighting various scenes and characters and aligning others to accomplish these goals? As a test case, let's briefly consider the image before us, which features a relief panel of the vow story from a Buddhist stupa in Gandhara. Like many visual representations of the vow story from Gandhara, this sculpture depicts the story in what has been called the conflated narrative mode, with multiple scenes from the story represented, while the figure of the protagonist is conflated instead of repeated from one scene to the next. This will make sense in just a second. In this case, Dipankara, the protagonist of the sculpture, appears once. The young woman appears twice, and the Buddha to be appears 3 times. You're like, once, twice, 3 times. So what at first guess might look like 6 separate figures are actually 3. First, the Buddha to be appears standing just left of center, looking into Dipankara's eyes. He has a water pitcher in his left hand and 5 water lilies in his right hand, which is raised to indicate that he is tossing the water lilies toward Dipankara as an offering. Second, he appears prostrate, having spread out his hair for Dipankara to step on, with his head at Dipankara's right foot, which he also holds with his right hand. Third, he appears in the upper left corner, floating miraculously in the air. Floating miraculously in the air with his hands clasped in front of him as a sign of respect. In other words, this one character appears 3 times. So what we have is a narrative conflated into a single image with one character appearing in 3 narrative moments. The young woman appears once standing next to the Buddha to be, and like him, she has a water pot in her left hand, lotuses in her right hand, and she looks into Dipankara's eyes. Unlike him, she smiles and clutches the lotuses to her chest, not yet ready to offer them. At the far left, she appears again, head bowed, with hands respectfully clasped in front of her. Dipankara appears only once, just right of center, his head encircled by a halo and the water lilies that have been offered to him, and he gazes back at the Buddha to be who stands before him. Dipankara Buddha's right hand is in the fear not gesture, Abhaya Mudra, which is a common hand gesture for Buddhas in Gandharan art, and his right foot stands firmly on the hair of the Buddha to be who lies prostrate before him. This is a bare bones version of the vow story, without kings or ministers or crowds of people, without any reference to Dharmaruchi or the various times they met, and with no hint of the marriage subplot. What is central to this account is Dipankara, who is a large and singular presence and the only figure marked with a divine halo. He is the proverbial star of the show. Before him are 2 figures engaged in 5 separate acts of veneration in an overlapping manner of presentation that undermines temporal succession. When we have separate times occurring all messed together, sequential acts are represented as happening simultaneously, what might be thought of as a synchronic view of diachronic time, demonstrating the continuity and interconnection of our actions and the salvific power of placing a Buddha at the center of them. One might view this sculpture as a model for action. If you get the chance to be in the presence of a Buddha, or even a Buddhist sculpture, perform acts of veneration, seeing, bowing, giving respect, making offerings, prostrating, or even touching, which will produce unprecedented karmic results. Now, here at the museum, we're really lucky. There is actually one version of this. There aren't that many around that look like this. There is one version of this sculpture that's here in the museum. And if you walk down a floor into the Asia Gallery, and you'll see a Buddha right in front of you, and then this one is tucked to the right, is a version of this story. What's really cool about this version is you'll see various figures have been knocked off, These things happen over time, right? So once again, we get 5 figures, right? And once again, one version of Dipankara, 2 versions of the girl, 3 versions of the Buddha to be making his offerings. But what's fascinating about this is it occurs in a totally different place. Suddenly we have an image that's taking place in the confines of either a palace or a temple, right? This is unknown in any of the textual versions. So we have here, what's so interesting is we have a visual history and a textual history, and they don't fully match up. And the visual history is earlier. So this is part of us kind of putting the pieces together here. And one thing that I find that's fascinating in the version that we have on the right, which is from the Metropolitan Museum, you'll also note in this figure in the right that's holding a Vajra. This is Vajrapani. And what I find fascinating about this figure of Vajrapani with this kind of thunderbolt in his hand is that he's this kind of muscular protector deity, is that he doesn't occur in any of the stories. So they just added one figure who occurs in no stories, and what you realize is that the images and the texts are fluid, right? They are part of an ongoing process where artists are responding in some level to the various stories that exist, but also reworking them and adding things in and subtracting things to create images that work, where we might say that what matters is efficacy and not fidelity. So we're seeing here a moment of efficacy, and to actually have one of these images here in the museum is incredible. There just aren't very many of them. And it's really a fluke that there just happens to be one somewhere where all the figures are fully formed that even still has the kind of the gold on it from its kind of original. Okay, so reflecting on the vow story as both text and image, how might individuals who came to Buddhist shrines and saw sculptures like these have responded to them? Judging by texts from that period, Buddhist shrines, especially those empowered by a Buddha's relics, were considered to be functionally equivalent to living Buddhas. The relics of a Buddha are alive, own property, perform miracles, inspire devotees, and are filled with various Buddha qualities in exactly the same way that the Buddha is. This does not mean that they are the Buddha, but that they make him present. Rather, they are themselves present in the same way that he is. They can act like him. They are a substitute for him in his absence. In addition, images of a Buddha were thought to channel or invoke that Buddha's presence, especially iconic images of a Buddha, but likely narrative images portraying events in his life as well. Furthermore, Gandhara was closely connected with Dipankara and home to numerous pilgrimage sites associated with his life, including the place where he accepted flowers from the Buddha to be and predicted his future awakening. In other words, it's quite likely that individuals went on pilgrimage to Buddhist shrines in Gandhara and treated those shrines and the images of Buddhas that adorn them as living Buddhas and as powerful objects for giving gifts, earning merit, and making vows, especially when those shrines and images were of Dipankara Buddha. We find the suggestion of something similar in the Avadana Shataka, the text known as 100 Stories, which was likely compiled by a Buddhist monk in Gandhara sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era. There are 10 stories there that follow a similar pattern, with an individual encountering a stupa for Vipassana Buddha, a different Buddha, and being inspired to make a vow to attain the awakening of an arhat, and then eons later, during the lifetime of Gautama Buddha, finally attaining arhatship. Most Buddhist communities, including the Mula Sarvastivadins, insist that one must be in the presence of an actual living Buddha, like flesh and blood living Buddha, to make the vow to become a Buddha. But one could apparently make other kinds of vows before a Buddha as shrine or a Buddha as image. Presumably, one could make a vow to attain the awakening of an arhat, as in that text, the Avadana Shataka, or a vow to be reborn as a disciple of a future Buddha, as with the great crowd of people in the story of Dharmaruchi. This innovation opened up new avenues for religious practice. The authors of the Avadana Shataka, like Buddhists today, were living in post-parinirvana times. There's no Buddha around, in an age where there was no Buddha present. The soteriological pattern they inherited, propounded was one that stressed the importance of meeting the Buddha in order to embark on the path to enlightenment. But meeting the Buddha in person is impossible in a time with no Buddhas, in a Buddhaless time. The solution that was adopted then was to leave open the possibility of meeting the Buddha in his relics and being inspired by them. Thus, in the Avadana Shataka, relics in the absence of a Buddha make soteriology possible, but they do not apparently open all soteriological paths. The relics are functionally equivalent to living Buddhas in bringing individuals to future arhatship, one form of awakening, but not in bringing them to full Buddhahood. There's a lesson here about the Buddha and Buddhist traditions. They are alive with possibility. For more than 2 millennia, Buddhism has evolved with events and stories reworked and re-represented to preserve traditions while also transforming them. Solutions are innovated in literature and art, in recitation and ritual, and possibilities are explored even as limitations are acknowledged. Sculptures of the vow story in Gandhara offer one such solution. To put it another way, the Buddha is dead. Long live the Buddha. Thank you very much.